I have another question I want to ask you. Because you had mentioned that there's been a lot of international work, and that you've recently pivoted to doing more domestic work, doing the same type of work around violence prevention and addressing the climate of political polarization, particularly as it manifests in conservative leaning faith communities. What are the biggest differences working overseas versus working at home here in the US? Like, are there certain aspects of the polarized and extremist political landscape in the US that's like more difficult than working in, say, Pakistan or all the other countries you mentioned?
You know, in some ways, absolutely not, and in some ways, yes. And I think the the absolutely not part of it is human conflict. While it is very complicated to unpack, and it's complicated to redirect if it's really gathering steam and people are really engaged in what I'm calling the kind of essentialist and existentialist cycle, where we reduce our own identities down to singularity, and we reduce the identity of the other down to a singularity. And if you're that, then you're a whole bunch of other things. And if I'm this, then I'm a whole bunch of other things. And there's no space for nuance. And then the existential part is now your identity and my identity are incompatible. They can't exist at the same time, and in fact you are dangerous to my very existence. Now there's only really one outlet, which is to eliminate the other, right? That kind of extreme uh, polarization of thinking and identifying self and other, and fear and conflict around that is not uncommon in the human experience, and there are plenty of examples of it throughout history. Now, every context, of course, is going to be radically different, even from individual to individual, much less community to community. And that means that you have to take an approach that allows you to receive principally from the people that you want to engage with, because you need to understand how they feel and see things. That's so much, and what assets they bring to bear, and what are the real things that are behind their fear or anger that might be part of the solution to this. I mean, we work a lot with religion, and so ideology is a big part of it, but in many cases that ideology is being used by certain conflict entrepreneurs to wrap around some more basic fears or concerns of individuals or communities, to mobilize them to act. And if you can get at some of those underlying issues, you can oftentimes de escalate and reorient the conversation away from this ideological polarization. It doesn't mean to move someone out of their faith belief or their convictions. It just means to start to address some of the core concerns that underlie that. Because most people, honestly, very few people, although they do exist, are really ideologically driven to hurt others. Most of the time, they need something or they're afraid of something, and that fear and that need can be intertwined. And a lot of times, it's kind of basic needs. It's, am I going to have a job? Are my kids going to have food? The things I believe in, is there room for that in this society? Do I have an outlet to express myself and to be who I want to be? And those things then are similar from space to space in the theoretical, but when it comes to the actual practical lived experience of it, it's going to be very different. And so our methods really are really initially based on hearing others and getting others to hear one another. And then there are some core methodologies that happen within that. How do you get someone to be open to hearing somebody? Well, there's lots of experience and practice on getting connected to someone's story, working with them to see that they do maybe have this other need, that maybe they shouldn't be attaching one part of the identity to the other part of the identity. And once you start working through some of those things, then you can build an openness for people to connect and reconnect, honestly, across some of the things that they do share, even though they see themselves as being very different. So it's a real mix between some kind of standard human experience and very unique expressions of that experience. And I think right now, in particular in the United States, one of the things that has changed things so dramatically is mis and disinformation using virtual platforms, so social media and non-traditional media has really changed the game, because it's about how someone uh, is engaged in defining who they are. Who do they trust? What language are they hearing? What messages are they hearing? And it's very, very different if you're in a little mud church in South Sudan, or in a temple in Cambodia, than it is when people are behind a screen somewhere in the United States, and both virtually and physically moving away from each other. So they're not exposed to the diversity of identity of the quote unquote other. So they can have this idea of, the other person being reduced to just a set of dangerous uh, beliefs, right? There's a funny story about that I'll share. You can cut it out if you wish. And I'm borrowing this from a pastor friend of mine, but he talks about this Muslim friend of his who went to a Philadelphia Eagles football game. And when it came to for prayer time, he kind of snuck into the cement corridor where they sell beer and stuff. And he was doing his prayer, and he felt this presence behind him. And as he's rolling up his prayer rug, when he finished and turns around, there's this big American guy behind him with this big football shirt on and his trucker hat and 8 beers in his hands. And he stares at him through his big beard, and he says, "You a Muslim?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am." He said, "I don't like Muslims from everything I've heard about them. But you're an Eagles fan, so you can't be all that bad." And then he walks off, right? But that really captures the essence of how identifying the multiplicity of people's identities is a pathway to understanding and empathy, and maybe even collaboration, that then can turn you away from these polarized singularities of who people are. So yeah, I mean, the Eagles fan thing wouldn't happen outside the United States. So right, context does matter. Um, and then the other thing on it, honestly, and maybe this is just a bit, it's revealed a bit about myself, is I've worked now my whole life in international affairs. Most of my adult life, I lived outside of this country. But I think we believed a certain thing about this country that is now proving to be less true, which is, yeah, we fight and debate and don't agree and don't like each other, but the society is built around, and the institutions are built around this idea of throwing all that disagreement into a space, letting it haggle and hash things out, and getting an imperfect response. And if you don't like it, then you throw those people out, you try new people in a couple of years, and that's how we sort of migrate forward together as a community that values difference, even if sometimes it's hard to swallow, right? Because if I want to be who I am and I want to be protected in that, I sure as heck better allow you to be who you are and have you be protected in that, right? So your difference from me is actually important to me because it allows for my difference from others, right? Obviously with some limits, there are laws about what you can and can't do based on those identity differences. But that whole thing was sacred in a way, at least in our myth of who we were, in a way that I think we're watching get really, really challenged and is deeply threatened right now. And so that, I think I've woken up a little bit from the collective dream that we were maybe impervious to some of the things that we've seen elsewhere, and that this was work that we are helping other human beings do in other places. And I think it's a really important awakening. And obviously, I'm not being naive. I know that the history of the United States is littered with identity violence and persecution and exclusion and hatred. Um, but maybe we were just getting a little complacent, that things were moving in the right direction. That people were willing to hear what we had to say about having a voice in the way government runs, about accepting people who are different than you are, about protecting people's rights because they are innate, regardless of superficial characteristics. And I think we were kind of coasting along thinking, hey, the world is moving in this direction. This is great. And now all of a sudden we're turning around and saying, wow, this stuff can break. It can break if it's not really carefully protected. And I think, um, maybe those of us in the policy world were a little naive about how delicate it was here at home. So, yeah, in that sense, just a little bit of personal, honesty and revelation about my own susceptibility to think there is an American exceptionalism. Well, guess what? Maybe there ain't, and we got to work harder at helping each other protect it, so that we're all safer and our kids are safer in a place where they can be who they want to work to be, and that's what we keep claiming is our society. So